Hello and welcome to Crucible of Words for more dedicated Legacy action. Today we've got a bonus video for you looking at cards from the new set BLOOMBURROW that might make it into Legacy. I've picked 15 cards I think might have a bit of a possibility and I'm just going to chat about them, so let's get right into it. First up we have Dark Star Augur. So this is just a flying Dark Confidant. So the body is a lot better than Dark Confidant. The problem with Dark Confidant is it has 1 toughness in the realm of Orcish Bowmasters, so not a great spot to be. 3 mana is quite a lot for this effect, but people were powering out stuff with Dark Rituals, and this is a reasonable thing you can power out on turn 1 that's going to be slightly more difficult to answer than something like a Dark Confidant. And sometimes you may be doing the Offspring, and then you end up getting 2 Dark Confidants, and that's a reasonable amount of card advantage. It doesn't have any particularly relevant creature types, so I'm not expecting this to be changing Legacy at all, but I think a few people might mess around with it in the mono black shells. There's quite a few mono black shells at the moment, and with Grief likely to get banned soon, people might be looking to sort of change up how their decks look. So this might be something that you could see in a few Legacy decks here and there. Next up we have Jackdaw Savior. So this is a 3 mana 3/1 flyer. Whenever this creature or another creature you control with flying dies, you return another type creature card with lesser mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, this is a 3/1 for 3 mana, which isn't great, but if it dies, you do get some value back. And we've seen cards like this before go into sort of combo decks. So Scrap Trawler was an artifact version that would get back other artifacts that cost less. And there was a few decks that were running that as a combo piece. Now, just any creature with lesser mana value is a lot of a wider net to cast than Scrap Trawler. So there's probably going to be some ways of building some kind of sacrifice deck where you can go infinite and get some value off of this, even if you're not going infinite. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some people messing around with this. I haven't built any deck lists myself, but I'm certainly intrigued by what this can bring, and I do love Jackdaws quite a lot. So there is that too. Next up we have Osteomancer Adept. This is a 2 mana 2/2 with Death Touch, so it can at least trade on the ground in combat with stuff, and it isn't going to get killed by Orcish Bowmasters. But the ability here is pretty interesting. So we can tap it, and then until end of turn, you may cast creature spells from your graveyard by foraging, in addition to paying their other costs. If you cast a spell this way, it ends up with a finality counter. A finality counter means that if it would go to the graveyard, it gets exiled. So foraging is where you exile 3 cards from your graveyard or sacrifice a food. So this is kind of like, if you look at it sideways, a creature-based Underworld Breach. You can play a bunch of creatures, but you still have to pay their costs, but you are foraging some of your cards in your graveyard away. There's definitely some options for this. There's a lot of decks that put a whole bunch of cards into their graveyard, whether you're looking at Hogak or some kind of sideways dredge deck or something. I don't think this is going to make waves in dredge, but I think something like Hogak could possibly be using this as a way of just getting a bunch of creatures back in a different fashion. It's quite a powerful effect, and I would expect to see some people messing around with it. Whether or not it actually ends up being great, I don't know. But the fact that it's just a Death Touch body, so it's going to trade into the bunch of Eldrazi's that are running around in the format right now, is pretty reasonable. The dream of playing Stitcher's Supplier and curving into this and getting something sweet back on the next turn, you know, that seems like some good value that I'm into. Next up, we have 2 cards that I'm displaying together. So we have Igra, Eater of All. I think I've butchered that pronunciation, but that's what we're going with. So this is an elemental cat. It's a 5 mana 6/6. It is a legend, so it is susceptible to things like Caracas. It has Ward, Sacrifice Food, which would normally be very good, but it has this other text that says other creatures, which includes your opponent's creatures and your own, are food artifacts in addition to their other types. So they can sacrifice any creatures to get rid of the Ward. Now that's still going to be reasonable as a way of deterring removal on it, and some decks with lots of removal don't have many creatures, so they might not have anything to sacrifice. So it might be hard to deal with for some sort of control decks. But the fact that it turns all other creatures into food tokens, that is quite an interesting thing to have access to. Because whenever you start messing with, you know, card types or having all the card types on something or whatever, you can often find ways of doing some pretty broken stuff with it. So Planar Nexus is a good example from a recent set where it has all card types, all non-basic card types on it, which means it ends up fueling a whole bunch of different things. There's also another bit of text on this card. Whenever a food is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. So this can get big very quickly. Now, why have I paired it with Camellia, the Seed Miser? So this is a 3 mana 3/3 with Menace, which is a reasonable stat block. It gives other squirrels you control Menace, which is fine. Whenever you sacrifice 1 or more foods, create a 1/1 squirrel token. So if you have these 2 cards on any creature in play, you can sacrifice it because it's a food and put some counters on your guy. But then, because a food died, you get a squirrel, which is also a food. So you can just go infinite and make an infinitely large creature. So that's kind of an interesting little combo. I imagine people will kind of mess with it because you can get both halves with a Green Sun Zenith. Now, it does require you to go into the combat step. But an important thing to remember is people love playing Nick Fit, which tends to want to play things up the curve, and this is certainly going up the curve a reasonable amount. Now, they're both being legends, which is kind of awkward, so it can be broken up relatively easily. I'm not expecting this to be a big thing, but I will be surprised if I don't see somebody trying it in Legacy at some point. Also, the other ability on the Camellia with the Forage, so you can just pay 2 and remove 3 cards from your graveyard or sacrifice a food and then pump your entire team of squirrels, is certainly going to be stacking up for a decent amount of damage. Now, is that up to Legacy power level? Probably not, but will people try it? Definitely. And you never know, maybe just having this 5 mana 6/6 that can't be targeted by a lot of control decks because they won't have creatures, maybe that's going to be good enough. Who knows? But I know there's going to be some Nick Fit players looking at this going, oh, I could do something with this. This is what I'm going to sacrifice my Veteran Explorer to ramp out. Right, on to the next one. The infamous Cruel Claw. Again, this is a legendary creature. It's a 3 mana 3/3 menace, so again, a reasonable stat block. And whenever the infamous Cruel Claw deals combat damage to a player, exile a card from the top of your library, and 2 exile a non-land card, you may cast that card by discarding a card rather than paying its mana cost. So, if you know the top card of your library and you connect with this menace creature, and you know that top card of your library is something that you want there that is pretty big, then you get it. So you could play some sort of like Worldly Tutor Jund deck where you just put Emrakul on top of your library, attack with this, and then cast Emrakul. There's a bunch of other stuff you can do with it too, but it's just good card advantage to get some free spells. If you're in black-red, your spells are generally proactive, whether they're discard spells, burn spells, or creatures, or whatever. You're going to end up with something you're going to be able to cast out of it. And, you know, you get to pitch excess lands or whatever, and get something a little bit better. I would be, again, surprised if nobody tried to do this by having a Grixis deck, brainstorming something really scary onto the top, like an Emrakul, for example, and just windmilling people with it, which would be pretty fun and pretty cool, and hopefully I'll be able to find a deck list and play on the channel at some point. Next up, we have Huskburster Swarm. This is an elemental insect. It's an 8 mana 6/6 with Menace and Death Touch, which are pretty interesting keywords to have. Although Death Touch on a 6/6 isn't always the most useful thing, but the fact that 2 things need to block it means it's definitely going to clean up whatever it gets blocked by. But the thing is here, this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature you own in exile and in your graveyard. So if you're playing some sort of Hogak deck where you're milling a bunch of cards into your deck, you could end up playing this for, you know, 2, 3 mana, maybe even 1 mana if things are going quite well in terms of milling yourself over. So this ends up being a very undercosted beta, a bit like Gurmag Angler was, which saw play Legacy for a very long time, and obviously Murktide Regent is a big thing too. Now, this doesn't have evasion in quite the same way as Murktide Regent, and it's not going to be as big as Murktide Regent, but the fact is, your graveyard being exiled doesn't stop you being able to cast this. So if somebody's like trying to leyline you out or whatever, you can mill over a bunch of cards, and this is still going to cost less because it counts the cards in exile, which is really interesting and means that it can be a decent body that you get to play when things aren't going so well, which is what I am quite attracted to when I look at new cards. Is if things aren't necessarily going 100% to plan, is this card still useful, right? It's a bit more like the catching up rather than win more is quite interesting to me. So I wouldn't be surprised to see this in some Hogak decks, and I'll probably jam it in some myself at some point. I do like a bit of Hogak every now and then. Now we're up to Beza the Bounding Spring. This is a 4 mana 4/5 in white. It is a legend. When it enters the battlefield, if you've got less lands than your opponent, you get treasure. If you've got less life, you gain 4 life. If you've got less creatures, you get 2 fishes. If you've got less cards, you draw a card. So this is a lot of stuff tacked onto it. It's a bit like Tiny Reinforcements was back in the day. This is just going to get you a good chunk of value. Now, this is something that you could run in some kind of Death and Taxes deck, potentially, if there's a lot of mid-rangey, fighty decks in the meta. So at the moment, there is quite a lot of Eldrazi. So maybe having this thing that can gain you some life, which is going to give you another hit, get a couple of chump blockers for the Eldrazi's, get some more cards, and just being a reasonable body on its own is quite good. And you can then block and then bounce it yourself with your Caracas and just replay it and kind of stem the tide of bleeding against the Eldrazi deck for a few turns. So it could be pretty good. It is 4 mana. And there are obviously some downsides to being a legend because your opponent will have Caracases as well. But it comes in and it gets you some value some of the time. And I think in sort of grindy mid-rangey matchups, having this potentially reusable engine is quite strong. And again, it blinks off of Yorion and all that sort of jazz too. So I wouldn't be surprised to see people trying this one out. Next up, we have Dewdrop Cure. This is a sorcery, 3 mana. Return up to 2 target creature cards. each with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If the gift was promised, instead return up to 3 target creature cards, each with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And gifting is basically, you say whether you will or will not give the gift as you cast a spell. So as you cast a spell, you say, you can draw a card. So then they get a card before your other abilities resolve. Now, giving your opponent a card isn't always where you want to be, but returning 6 mana values worth of creatures to play with 1 card is quite a lot for a sort of white deck. Now, is this going to be doing anything super impressive? We've seen other things not too dissimilar to this. There was one in New Capenna, I believe, that was kind of similar to this. But the amount of value you can get off this is quite large. And if you've got things like Orcish Bowmasters in your like black-white Dead Guy Ale style deck, then making your opponent draw a card isn't always a downside either, and you might be able to get the ping off with it. It does seem like a lot of value. This isn't something you want to be playing a lot of copies of, but it's a really nice way, maybe against some control decks or whatever, to suddenly refuel in a big way in the mid to late game after they've been trying to remove some of your creatures. I think I maybe got this one a little bit high on the list, but the upside of this is very, very strong, but whether or not you can leverage it in a meaningful way in Legacy remains to be seen. Next, we're into Frogtown. Flubs the Fool. Now, this card is really fun. It's a 3 mana 0/5, so not the most aggressive stat line you've ever seen, but it's rogue mana, and you get to play an additional land on each of your turns, and whenever you play a land or cast a spell, draw a card if you have no cards in hand, otherwise discard a card. So this is kind of like Recycle, which was a card that many people tried to mess around with and break, and it didn't hold up in the long term of Magic the Gathering, but for a while people were playing sort of Recycle decks a long time ago. Now, what this card does that is a lot more interesting to me is it's 3 mana, which is very castable. It pitches to Force of Will, pitches to Endurance, pitches to Fury. That's pretty tasty. It also is tutorable via Green Sun Zenith. So you could just have one of these as like a sort of late game, we get to draw stuff again type thing if you wanted. Or you could build your deck around this to try and power out a bunch of cards. So we see things like Song of Creation in combo decks at the moment. Now this is kind of similar, where you get to redraw stuff when you cast spells. Now, you don't just get to redraw 2 every turn, but you also don't have to discard your entire hand at the end step. And like I said, this is tutorable off of Green Sun Zenith. Anything that's a green creature that's reasonably costed makes me think about Green Sun Zenith. So I wouldn't be completely surprised to see some people running this as an option. But most importantly, just look at that glorious art, right? How can you not want to see this on a Magic the Gathering table near you? All right, next up, it's another frog. This is Glab Calamity's Augur. This pretty swag-looking frog is bug mana for a 2/4 death touch, so it can trade in play with a lot of stuff. It is a legend, so it's susceptible to Karakas, but again, it's blue, so it pitches to Force of Will. It's black, pitches to Grief. That's probably not going to be very relevant for very long. Pitches to Endurance. It's also Green Sun Zenithable, as we've discussed before, and it is a wizard, which is sometimes relevant in some step-through decks. I doubt this is going to be making any sort of step-through decks go into these sorts of colours, because the main step-through decks you have are very, very blue-heavy, and they usually splash into red or white. So I don't think that's going to be relevant, but you never know. But the abilities on this card are pretty cool. You may look at the top card of your library anytime, and you may play lands and cast spells with mana value 4 or greater from the top of your library. So this means you can cast a Force of Will from the top of your library, and your opponent can never thought seize it if it's on the top of your library. So you could just float that there with a Brainstorm if you wanted to, and that's pretty cool. Now, it also just taps to Surveil 2, and you can do that every turn. That is incredible value, and allows you to sort of dig into some pretty gnarly spells. Now, being able to only cast spells with mana value 4 or greater in a format that, like Legacy, which is defined by cheap spells, might not seem the best, but there are a bunch of spells that you play for less mana than are actually written on the card. So something like a Murkside Regent, for example, you're normally paying 2 mana for that, but it is obviously more than mana value 4. So there's a few things like that in the format which may be able to play off this, but just being able to Surveil 2 and getting free lands off the top of your library is, you know, that alone is pretty reasonable, especially on a Death Touch body. So I would be looking forward to seeing this come along. Like we see things like Leovold kicking around as well in Legacy, and this feels a similar-ish power level to Leovold in some respects. Like, yes, Leovold protects itself in a way because you get a card back when it dies, but this is going to get you cards off the bat because you're probably going to be able to get a land off of it or whatever. And then if you untap with this, the value you get off it is huge. Now, Leovold obviously stops your opponent drawing, but there's no reason why you can't run both, right? They're both Green Sun Zenithable as well. So all hail Glab is what I'm saying. I think this card is really cool. Next up, we have Thought Stalker Warlock. This is a 3-mana 2/2 with Menace. When it enters, choose target opponent. If they lost life this turn, you get to Thoughtseize them. Otherwise, they just discard a card. So there are definitely some black-white decks that have creatures that they want to blink a bunch. Now, this is quite a good one to blink. And if you're in an aggressive deck and you just like, you know, you're in Legacy, you're going to need to commit something to the board in the first couple of turns in a creature deck. So if you get to attack your opponent for 1, let's say with your Orc Army token on turn 3, then you play this. You get a Thoughtseize and a 2/2 body with evasion. That is quite a lot of upside, and any sort of Flicker Wisps or whatever you have are then going to blink this again, and you can use things like Flicker Wisp off of an Ether Vial or Ephemerate in your opponent's draw step, and just blink this and take the last card out of their hand that they've just drawn. So I think this card is pretty reasonable. There's a lot of people who like playing sort of Dead IL, Death and Taxes, that sort of fair black-white deck with blinky stuff going on. And this can fit quite nicely into that sort of shell. Alright, we're getting up to the big ones now. Here is Sunspine Lynx. This is a 4-mana 5/4, and it has some pretty interesting text on this one. Players can't gain life. Damage can't be prevented. And when it enters, it deals damage to each player equal to the number of non-basic lands that player controls. So it's kind of like a half of a Price of Progress on the body when it enters. But damage can't be prevented is a really interesting clause in Legacy right now because the One Ring exists. Now, what this does, let's say against a Cloud Post deck that's got a bunch of non-basic lands, and you're attacking your opponent a bit, and then they play a One Ring to like fog for a turn. And you just untap, you play this cat out, they'll take like, you know, 5 damage from their lands, and then all your creatures still get to attack. And then your opponent is in trouble. You also get to shut off things like Glimmer Post with the players can't gain life action. Like, this card seems playable. Now, it is a 4-mana 5/4 in the format of Legacy, which is a lot of mana to be spending on a spell, but the fact is that you can blank the One Ring, and it's not just you have to play this at the right time to blank the One Ring. As long as it's in play, the One Ring will not prevent stuff. And I think that is quite an interesting bit of text to have in the format right now. I've certainly wanted Bone Crusher Giants in Legacy decks lately, just for the ability to stomp myself and make damage non-preventable for a turn, and all the sort of Nickfit decks are loving a bit of the old questing beast to come in and have that damage can't be prevented clause against the One Ring too. And Cloud Post is a very good deck, and it's only going to get better when Grief gets banned, so I think that's definitely something to keep an eye on. The one question I have with this card though is, what deck does it go in? Because there's not really something that immediately jumps out at me of like, oh, okay, yeah, this is the deck that this fits in. But it is a powerful tool to keep an eye on, and I'm certainly going to mess around with it a little bit in Legacy. All right. We are into a nice little blue instant for you. Into the Floodmoor, which has absolutely incredible art, which I adore. This is some of my favourite art from the set, I think. It is just great. So this says, this is another gift card, except instead of giving your opponent a card like some of the previous ones we've seen, this is, you give your opponent a tapped 1/1 creature, which is basically irrelevant in terms of Legacy power level. So the text of this is, return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. If you gift it instead, then you get to return target non-land permanent to their hand. So this is kind of like a Chain of Vapor type effect, and they see a lot of play in Legacy because combo decks have to answer various permanents. Now, most of the decks that want to play this sort of effect, they will not care at all about their opponent having a 1/1 fish. So this is just a nice way of being able to bounce a problem permanent and sort of move on with life. You get to bounce creatures for 1 mana without even giving them a 1/1, which is quite nice because maybe you need to bounce something like a Thalia, or obviously that's going to cost you additional mana, but you have Thalias, you have Containment Priest, you have F-Sworn Canoness. There's a bunch of creatures that you might want to be bouncing out of play, and obviously just being able to hit any non-land permanent for 1 mana is a very strong effect. People play Chain of Vapor in Legacy precisely because of that. You see Void Snare in people's sideboards for Burning Wish. What I will say about the Chain of Vapor is Chain of Vapor has some additional text in terms of being able to copy it. So sometimes that has a downside if your opponent can copy it and bounce a permanent that you need to have in play. But quite a lot of the Storm decks, when they board in their Chain of Vapors, they bounce their own like artifact mana a bunch. So they float all the mana from their lands, bounce all their artifact mana, replay it, and increase their Storm. So that's obviously something you don't get to do with the Into the Floodmoor here. But just having a 1 mana answer for any non-land permanent in play for a turn is really strong, and this will see some play somewhere. Alright, our last card is a little Raccoon Scout. This is a green-green 3/3. As long as there are 4 or more card types among cards exiled with Keen-Eyed Curator, it gets +4/+4 and has Trample, and it has 1 colourless mana to exile target card from a graveyard. So the immediate comparison here is Scavenging Ooze, which sees play in Legacy. People are Green Sun's anything up a Scavenging Ooze all the time. Now, Scavenging Ooze grows when it eats creatures, as well as also getting you some life. But if you're trying to exile stuff for your opponent's thing and they don't have that many creatures, then you don't get the extra bonus of the Scavenging Ooze, right? So you're not going to be getting that life, you're not going to be growing your creature. This creature already starts off slightly bigger, which is a nice place to be. It's harder to get it to be big, but when it is big, it also has a form of evasion in trample, and it can be a 7/7. But what I really like about this card is the fact that it's colorless mana to exile cards from graveyard. Now, sometimes I've found in some Green Sun Zenith decks, when I'm going to find my Scavenging Ooze, it kind of taxes my green mana in a way that I'm not always happy with. Now, this does cost green to put into play, but most of the time, you're going to be tutoring this with a Green Sun Zenith anyway. And just having colorless mana that you can channel into this means that you can exile more stuff in response to anything your opponent's doing, as well as being able to play whatever spells you want whilst holding up any mana to activate this. So I think this is going to see some play in Legacy. People are going to be Green Suns anything for this. Is it going to be better than Scavenging Ooze in the long run? I'm not sure, but I think it might be. I think having the colorless activated ability is really strong. And at the end of the day, when you're trying to do stuff with Scavenging Ooze, you're not trying to make a big creature and gain life. That's not what Scavenging Ooze is all about. Sometimes that happens, and that's nice. But generally, you just want it there as a piece of graveyard hate. And it can chip down for a little bit of damage here and there. So this chips down for more damage on its base stats. And it's easier to use this to hate an opponent's graveyard than it is a Scavenging Ooze. So I think on that front, I'm going to say I would like to test this over a Scavenging Ooze in a lot of decks. And, you know, if you ever do get the +4/+4 in trample, that is pretty enormous. And there are a lot of decks trying to get Delirium at the moment, thanks to Dragon's Rage Channeler being in existence, as well as people playing things like Necrogoyf or whatever. Just, you know, cards that... Was it Necrogoyf or Nethergoyf? I can't remember which one it is. But the new one that costs 1 mana. So people having a bunch of different card types in their graveyard. So it's not exactly difficult to exile cards. And you can exile your own cards with this just to get yourself the big buff if you want. Because it's not just cards from an opponent's graveyard. So I think this card is going to see play. And initially, I think I prefer it to Scavenging Ooze. We'll see how that feels going forward. But just the base stats of being a 3/3 and the colorless activation is really big news to me. And who doesn't want to play a lovely little Raccoon Scout? Alright, and that is the end of this video. So, let me know what you think. Do you think I missed any cards here? Do you think any of my cards that I've mentioned are nonsense and they shouldn't be on this list? Just let me know. You never really know until you finally get to play with the cards. But these are the things that I had a little look through the spoiler and thought, yeah, I could see something. And I hope I've explained where I'm coming from with some of these. I hope you're looking forward to playing some cute little animals in Bloomburrow like I am. If you want to see the weird things I'm going to be playing, by all means, remember to subscribe to the channel, because then you won't miss any of my content. And why not drop me a like? It doesn't cost you anything, and it really helps. Alright, thank you so much for joining me on this mini little set review. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.
If you'd like to support me in the channel, please check out my Patreon. It has a free guide to budget turbo depths, as well as 3 tiers of support. A low-cost one that enters you into my monthly raffle for a free donation deck on the channel, a mid-tier subscription that gives you access to my detailed turbo depths guide that is updated every month, as well as regular articles, and lastly, the higher tier gives you all of the above, as well as a monthly donation deck for my channel. If you're interested in supporting the channel this way, please check out the link in the description.